So, so I called my partner right in the moment and thought I was conveying to him what happened. And then I got home 10 minutes later and I was like really distressed. And he was like, "What? Like somebody thought your car was an Uber?" And I was like, "What story did you just hear?" Right? Like, what story did you just hear? Then I engaged in some mindfulness meditation to try to keep my arousal down. And then the nerd that is me, that has no boundaries between work and life, was like, what an interesting memory phenomenon, right? Because I was in there staring at my phone, looking at a news article. I had no idea what that news article was, right? Like I don't remember what block I was on. Like so many things are distorted, and then also like I didn't piece together a good memory even in the moment because my partner thought I was telling him about somebody thinking my car was an Uber when I thought my life was threatened. And then and beyond that, in the next like days to weeks, we talk about intrusive memories after trauma a lot. It wasn't me reliving the experience again. For this experience on its own, it was hearing my voice screaming, "Get out!" in my head, right? Now jump 2 weeks forward, and I guess I only see terrifying movies in the theater. I went to go see Get Out at night with Chelsea. A lot of contextual reinstatement. And I was going back to my car, and I was like, I'm not taking Gerard home. Like, I'm going to find another more populated way to get home, right? So let's not dwell on the negative parts of this, but just extract the memory components of it. And now we can have a lot of fun talking about why I think all this stuff happened. Yeah? Okay, so we know the medial temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, encodes memories of the past, right? So when I'm in a moment trying to think about what happened with this experience, that was a really high arousal experience, we're relying on the medial temporal lobe structures in some ways. But we also know our memories provide the lens in which we perceive the world and make decisions about the world, right? So we don't just hang on to memories to think about the past, but we use these memories in a functional way to guide our behavior. For example, deciding not to take Gerard home after seeing another terrifying movie at night means I'm recalling my past memories in service of what I'm doing sort of in the moment, right? So we know that memories have all these utility for how we walk through the world, but we also know memory is capacity limited. We can't remember everything, and then the shape of the memories that we learn are very different depending what state we are in the moment. And when I was in grad school, Allison and Adcock and I, we wanted to try to sort of get a framework to think about this huge space of goal states and memory. And we landed on this idea of differentiating between an interrogative goal states, which we think are sort of motivation when you're curious and you're exploring the world and you just want to understand how things work, versus these imperative goal states where you have a single urgent threat in front of you, right? And we were thinking about sort of parsing apart how the memories of the world might look different under these states, where when you're curious and exploring, you get these really rich maps, relational maps of the world that are flexible and you can manipulate. But when you're in these states of threat by imperative motivation, you're sort of left with one salient feature popping out, maybe a handful of features popping out, but they're decontextualized from the rest of the world, right? So I think this is an idea that we can all relate to, right? We've had memories in these different states. We've had memories of seeing a horror movie versus going to Disney World. Oh, there's my privilege. Sorry, going to something fun. But they're different naturally, right? But what we wanted to do is start to lay over a neurobiological framework of trying to understand why these differences emerge. And we started with some classic data that we knew emerging from memory research, that we have different parts of the medial temporal lobe. So the whole medial temporal lobe is contributing to memory, but different parts of it contributed to different ways, right? And we know the hippocampus is really engaged with these rich relational maps of the world, but then when you have these isolated memories that are decontextualized, that often relies on cortical regions that surround it, like the perirhinal cortex and the perihippocampal cortex. So through a large body of work, we developed a model of this space, mapping on these interrogative and imperative goal states onto discrete neural systems. I'm going to really focus on the imperative goal state side today, which we think engages the amygdala and that drives this cortical MTL regions that aren't great at forming relational memories, and sort of gives you this pop out effect in the world. And that's different from an interrogative state where you're exploring things which might engage the VTA, then drive hippocampal function and give you these really rich relational maps of the world. And at first glance, and this is like a pet peeve and a soapbox I would die on. That's not a statement. What do you, a hill? A hill or a soapbox I won't get off of? Sorry, something that I will like take to the grave with me. I need to stop making metaphors. It's not helping. I won't make any more metaphors. Okay, is that you might at first glance just think this is about valence, right? Like, oh, okay, rewards get you into this interrogative state and threat gets you into this imperative state. But I want to give two really like caveats or examples to this, because while that is true in general, I don't think valence is the right word. And this is why we say interrogative and imperative. The first one is, imagine you're looking at a snake. That is a negative event if you're afraid of snakes, no matter what. But there is a fundamental difference in your goal states, and I mean all the way through the goal states, how you're thinking, how your body's feeling, how you're moving, when you run into a snake while you're in the woods on a hike versus if you go to the zoo and the snake is behind a protective layer, right? There is a layer beyond valence that it just isn't capturing that. So that's why we say this imperative goal state's about single goals. That you might say, okay, yeah, valence isn't enough. It's just about arousal then, right? Like when you're in the woods, there's really high arousal states, but we even know in states of matched arousal, right? My heart rate could be going up just as high as a roller coaster or if I'm in a car accident. But again, just think about your goal states in those moments. And there's something fundamentally different about your goal state. So it's not enough to just be thinking about the valence or just be thinking about your arousal levels, but it's really some type of interaction between the both of them. And that's just going to be important as we think about the data that I'm going to show. Okay, cool. I wonder what's next. So I don't want you to just take my word on this model. I want to give you a little evidence, just some primers of where we sort of got into this space. And the first thing I was really big on homology when I was in grad school. And I was like, let's just translate all the animal models up into human research, which I still do a little bit, but think about it a little bit more deeply. So what we did is we generated a virtual reality version of the Morris water maze task. We know this is a hippocampal dependent task, right? And we're saying, okay, let's layer on incentives onto this task so we can tease apart these different states. So in one version of the task, in the interrogative version, you were trying to approach a reward. So if you got to the correct platform location, you earned a reward. If you got to the incorrect platform location, you didn't get the reward. And we contrasted this against another group of participants that were doing the same task, except now in an imperative motivational state, which means rather than sort of approaching the goal of getting to the correct platform, if they didn't get there in enough time or hit the incorrect platform before they got there, they would receive a shock in the moment, right? And now we wanted to look at what navigation performance looked like, which is our marker of hippocampal dependent memories across these two states. So the first thing that we found, which shouldn't be surprising because I gave it away by showing you the model first, right, is that under these states of reward, we see enhanced hippocampal dependent memories in this water maze task, and under states of threat, we saw reduced hippocampal performance. So it looks like these states of threat might actually be disrupting relational binding, giving you sort of more sparse, unitized representations of encoding in the environment. The second layer, which might be a little bit more surprising, and it gets back at this point that we can't just map things onto incentives. During this task, we also had participants collecting physiological arousal through skin conductance levels. And what I'm going to show you now is the groups separately, the threat group and the reward group, across participants, depending on what their physiological arousal levels were during the time of learning. And what we see is, while in the threat group, there's no relationship to it. So people were pretty like threatened already. It wasn't sort of indicative based off of their arousal. In the reward group, there's this like really interesting set of people that showed really high threat responses and then we're bombing on the task, right? And there's this well-known literature of like the threat of reward, right? Like when reward incentives get so high, it can actually induce threat in some people. I don't know if people are like studying for their GREs or something, but like imagine that, right? Like it becomes so important what it is that it flips over into this sort of single goal orientation state. So we think that's what is going on in this group. And again, I'm bringing this up now because I want to really, I'm going to keep on weaving back in that we need to focus on things like arousal while we unpack this data, and we can't just rely on the incentives alone to understand the data. But the big take home point is these threat states are actually disrupting hippocampal dependent representations, but this is just a behavioral proxy of it. What's actually happening in the brain that helps us sort of unpack this model a little bit more. So what we did is we then ran a neuroimaging study that was sort of like a sledgehammer to get at this point. I also accidentally ran the cover story for the Milgram study, but like actually ran it without the social manipulations, which I didn't realize till like 10 years later. But what we did was we had people doing this simple task where they saw a cue. The cue indicated, are you going to get a shock or is there no threat of shock at all, right? Then it was followed by a fixation cross and then a scene image that they had to learn. And what they were told is at the 24-hour test, if you forget this scene image and it was preceded by a shock cue, you would receive a shock for forgetting. In the no shock condition, there was no threat at all, right? Then they go through 60 trials of each on this. Then after they finish the encoding, we basically tell them that it was just a manipulation of encoding. There's no chance they're going to get shocks tomorrow. So that way we know we're really targeting encoding goal states. Then they come back 24 hours later, do a memory test now without any incentives at all. And what we find is that they have better memory in the threat of shock condition versus the control condition. And you might be like, whoa, what's happening? You just said memory gets worse. The difference here is that this is very simple item memory, right? Did I see this scene or not? You don't need this contextual representation of the world around you to answer this question. You can just rely on knowing knowledge of the item that was the source of threat. But individuals do better on the threat trials versus the no threat trials. Okay, the good news is we had them in the scanner while they're doing encoding, so we can start to unpack what is actually driving these types of memory enhancements. And what we found is we first looked at during this anticipatory states, right? When the goals are activated, but you don't have the information that you're learning, did a whole brain search. And the only region that showed up as predicting memory during this anticipatory state was in the amygdala. And then when we looked at functional coupling with the amygdala in this time-lagged fashion, so you're ramping up the amygdala for learning, what consequences does that have to the medial temporal lobe when you're actually encoding the information that you're learning? And what we saw is that it was targeting cortical MTL, not the hippocampus, to drive learning in this state, right? So we're starting to unpack, okay, this is why threat might drive you to these item-based representations, because it's engaging this circuit between the central medial, or oh, spoiler alert, between the amygdala and the cortical medial temporal lobe. Okay, let me take a pause to take a break because I talked too fast, and see if everybody's sort of like on board so far for the like foundation of where this talk is going. I don't see anybody like looking in a state of panic or anything. Okay, so if we're feeling really confident with our foundation, then we can bring up like, uh-oh, there's a little snag in the road, right? And this snag in the road was sort of haunting me since my third year of grad school, and I just kept on being like, I'll think about this later. Like, I'm gonna think about this later. Oh, no, let me just think about this later. The snag in the road is, and maybe some of you are feeling this now, is like, wait a minute, I've learned about fear conditioning. The amygdala talks to the hippocampus, right? Or I've learned about all these cases that's taught in textbook that like the thing that's good for the world is amygdala hippocampal coupling, and that's what gives you better memory, right? And I was like, I at some point need to deal with that. Like, I need to deal that this is a narrative in the world. Eventually, just to really reinforce this part, Maureen Ritchie and I, who's a very close collaborator and colleague, we ran a meta-analysis on all the emotional memory studies that existed at that time point, just saying what are the reliable networks that are engaged during emotional memory processing. And we found that, like, yes, you robustly get the amygdala for this affective type of learning. And yes, you get the cortical MTL too, but you also get anterior hippocampus in these states, right? So it caused the problem because there's this giant hole in the model. So luckily, with more time and more thinking, and while like not avoiding thinking about this snag in the model, it just came to the point that we had to remember, like, oh, the amygdala is not this unitary structure that it does all the same things in the world. And at least through the lens of fear conditioning, there's really two very important distinctions in the amygdala. One is that there's the basolateral amygdala that's thought to do a lot of the associative learning, also thought to do salience detection in the world. So it might be doing a lot of sort of the learning parts of the emotional learning paradigms. But then we also have this central medial amygdala portions, and we know that this is responsible for the defensive behaviors that emerge from threat. So things like generating those high arousal responses, generating freezing behaviors, all the things that we are trying to capture in our imperative motivational framework map so much more strongly onto the central medial amygdala rather than the basolateral amygdala. So Maureen at the time had a really high resolution resting state fMRI data set, and we're like, okay, why don't we start to tease apart what's going on with the functional coupling during rest, which we can talk about rest later. I'm actually not a huge fan of it sometimes, but sometimes it does a good job at what it's supposed to be doing. Why am I giving so many caveats? I should just present data. Okay, so what we did then is we looked in the hippocampus and we wanted to just say, while no task was happening, while the sort of, this intrinsic state of the brain, are there differences in the way the basolateral amygdala and the central medial amygdala are functionally coupled to the hippocampus? And what we saw was that there was greater functional coupling of the basolateral amygdala with the hippocampus rather than the central medial amygdala. So this is starting again to build this narrative that's like, okay, it's not just the amygdala. We now need to get to a higher resolution and think about, it's actually maybe more about regions that are generating defensive behaviors. And this is now how I've been thinking about the world, is that we need to sort of step away from just saying, oh, it's negative, but like it's that defensive threat-based response. So I'm gonna again use that as a cue. It sort of falls in well with the water maze data that I showed you, that in these really high arousal subjects, that type of high arousal putatively would be coming from signals in the central medial amygdala, not the basolateral amygdala. And we think that is what is really disrupting relational memory binding, hippocampal function, these sort of rich associative networks that you just don't have when you're in a state of threat. Okay, so as the briefest of summaries, in this past work, we found that there's this, a foundation of interactions between defensive behaviors, arousal, and sort of decontextualized memories. And you could think then, oh, maybe this is why Deepu talked about that experience he had in the car, because this is the example of it, right? Like all these things are emerging from this circuit. And, I fortunately didn't suffer from any PTSD symptoms from that exposure, but you can also get a sense that there's a lot of overlapping set of what we're trying to capture in our model and symptoms of PTSD, right? There's a lot of reliving in PTSD, and I just want to really let people know reliving is often described as episodic memories. It is not. If you look at trauma narratives and actually talk to patients about their reliving, unless I'm wrong, you should let me know. It's often not these rich contextualized sensations. Often it's like sensory features popping up or sort of unique moments, and people will build narratives off of that, but the original trigger of an intrusive memory is really sparse from my take of reading the field. But then you also have these things like hyperarousal, mood deficits, avoidance, and defensive behaviors. So we were looking at this PTSD literature, and at the same time, I got part of this bonkers multi-site project called the Aurora Project, where they were getting hundreds of thousands of people coming from emergency rooms and then tracking a ton of symptoms and behaviors and physiology of them. Of this really large sample, a subset of them came in for deep phenotyping, which means 2 weeks after the trauma, we had them in the lab and we were able to get more in-depth data. The ones I'm going to talk about today is that they did a threat detection task where they were looking at fearful versus neutral faces. And then they also did a startle task, which allowed us to map defensive behaviors. So my research assistant at the time, Busra Tunraverdi, was like, I think we're set to test your model in a way where it actually might mean something, right? Like, great thing sitting in the lab. Let's see if it actually means something in the world. So what we did first is we looked at threat-related responses in these individuals that were exposed to trauma in the past 2 weeks, right? And I think if you took a step back and we're just sort of in like PTSD world without thinking of our model, you would make strong predictions, I think, that the greater hippocampal reactivity you would have, the more PTSD symptoms you would have, right? Like I think if you just took like a gestalt view of what was out there. But if you bring our model into the space, you would actually predict the exact opposite, right? You're in this defensive threat-oriented state, and that's actually going to pull resources away from the hippocampus during threat processing. And indeed, this is what we found, was that the greater responses you had in the hippocampus to threat, the lower your PTSD symptoms, and then the less responses you had in the hippocampus. So if you're biasing information processing away from the hippocampus during threat, then you have more PTSD symptoms. So this was like bingo bongo. I think we're heading in the right direction, right? And I think in some ways this is actually giving a fundamentally different view of how to think about the hippocampus and its role in PTSD. But on top of that, we actually had data to add one more layer into this response, because we don't think it's the hippocampus on its own that is generating the sequelae of events that lead you to these fragmented memories. Rather, what we think is happening is that your response to threat is to get to defensive behaviors, right? We don't, like, in a world, I wish I could like measure people's shoulder movements so we could actually get freezing behavior in the moment. We don't have that. What we do have is that they all went through a startle paradigm where you get blasted with air bursts in your hand. You can measure how much people startle to it, to cues that predict threat and safety. And then this gives us a sense of how much defensive behavior individuals have. So what you can specifically use, and what seems to be the most sensitive in PTSD, is to look at extinction to the safety and danger cues, and then you can get a marker of defensive responses from that. And again, now in our model, this idea of shunting information processing away from the hippocampus should be particularly exacerbated if you're in a state where you have really high defensive responses, right? That is the solid predictions from the model. And again, this is exactly what we found. This is just plotting it as separated into two groups, but we ran it as a continuous variable. But this relationship between PTSD symptoms and hippocampal threat reactivity was really limited to individuals that showed really strong defensive behavior on this separate task, right? So it seems like we're starting to draw upon some real life utility in this model, and that it's able to predict the types of maladaptive behaviors that we see in PTSD. Okay, so then we're pretty jazzed about this, except I went back to look at the like gajillions of measures they collected in the Aurora sample, and guess what measures weren't there? Anything having to do with memory. There was no memory measures in the sample, so we sort of fell short on that dimension. And I should stop running my mouth so much, but I'm just going to do it. It sort of brought up this like extreme frustration I have with the PTSD community from the not clinical standpoint, but from the clinical neuroscience and psychiatry standpoint, because we have known for decades that the hippocampus is not working great in PTSD. We've known for decades that this is happening. But we know individuals with PTSD have memories, and they have reliving of memories, and nobody was talking about where these memories were going, right? They were having declarative memories. They had to be going somewhere. I shouldn't say nobody. Neil Burgess and Jim Bixby, I think, are the only other people speaking in this space of trying to target where these things are going. But our model, and they got converging evidence of making these predictions too, is that we solidly think that the memories are getting driven towards the perirhinal cortex, and that's what's making them so perceptually biased and really hard to handle in the clinic, because you don't have the context around it to work with, right? And that's a much harder thing to extinguish than something that you have more contextual cues to shut down. Okay, now I want to be a hypocrite and yell at myself for a minute. Here I am going on and on about like, listen here, psychiatrists, you need to talk about memory phenomenology more, and you're being really cursory about it. And then here I've been spending a decade just looking at memory accuracy in the world, right? Which in some ways is not the richest characterizations of memories that exist in the world. That being said, I will continue to run memory accuracy studies forever because they're very informative. They're very, very informative. But I say aha here, they're a little bit like the two-dimensional side of him looking at himself in the mirror. And we wanted to start to think about making these more three-dimensional in terms of our memory. We are scratching at the surface of what a memory is. And we're finding really robust things just by scratching at the surface. But that must mean there is so much more underneath it. Quick public service announcement. If you don't know what this frame is, I'm fundamentally disappointed with you, but I'll give you the opportunity to watch this music video afterwards on YouTube, right? And if you haven't watched it, like, grow up, right? Like, join the rest of us. Okay, pause. So what do I mean then about sort of diving deeper into memory phenomenology? One way I've been thinking about it is that we sort of need to just move behind accuracy, which sort of traps you in this binary bin, like yes or no. And like maybe you can extend it out more by saying like, okay, yes or no to item versus relational. Cool, we're getting 4 markers of memory now, right? But what I really wanted to think about was things like the structure of memory and the form of memory and the contents that are in there and how they're embedded. So we're trying to now in the lab start to move into this space while running those other studies that are focusing on accuracy. But the other reason I think I was really inspired to do this is that like, I do like to dabble in clinical work, right? Like I'm predominantly a cognitive neuroscientist, but I dabble in this clinical work side of it, and actually thinking about trauma, 3-dimensionality is the most important part of it, right? There's so much embedded in trauma memories. And then there's all these beautiful therapies in trauma that are about constructing narratives and the power of constructing narratives. And you are not going to know anything about constructing a narrative if you're just looking at memory accuracy, right? You need to get this richness of the data set to start to understand it. So in the last data I'm going to show you is we've moved into the world of free recall. My poor trainees. Life is so much easier when you don't study free recall. But we've been diving deep into free recall. And the last set of studies I'm going to show you is really targeting, can we learn more about threat-related arousal through the lens of free recall memory? Okay, so again, thinking about either the experience I shared with you or the trauma memories that individuals go to the hospital for, one thing about them is that they feel really fragmented, right? There's something about them, and I don't love this word. I don't know what it means, right? Like it's like a word in search of an operational definition that we don't have yet. But some things that sort of pop up when I've been thinking about this is that for fragmentation to exist, it means it can never be a single moment, or else how does that get fragmented? And you need something that sort of unfolds over time. So we wanted to work in a memory space that we had really high threatening events that unfold over time. I live 5 blocks away from Terror Behind the Walls, which is at Eastern State Penitentiary. They are awesome and willing to play with researchers like quite well. So what we did is we started a collaboration with Terror Behind the Walls, and it is basically a haunted house, and it is like threat central, right? Like chainsaws are happening, and there's blood on the walls, and there's syringes, and like pig carcasses, and people jumping at you with chainsaws and stuff. Like, I mean, this is a high threatening event. I know it's not like ecologically valid because this doesn't happen to people continuously over 45 minutes, but it is capturing a really high arousal space that you move through in time. So what we did in this study, and I need to give like super shout outs to Chelsea Helian. This is like a total joint effort. I'm going to be presenting all the memory studies on it, but Chelsea has like a beautiful set of separate findings that are about emotion regulation and uncertainty estimation and metacognitive emotion. So this was like a huge joint effort. But what we did for our arm of it is that we had people go into the haunted house. We had them wearing heart rate monitors because we know arousal is a really important factor of breaking up these things. They come back a week later and they freely recall everything they can from the haunted house. And some cool things about this design that are worth mentioning is that I keep on saying like the great grandchild of Tolman must have designed this haunted house. It is functionally a 6-arm radial maze, right? And what makes it even better is that in each one of these arms, it's a different semantic category of what's going on. So like there's one that's delirium, which is all like sort of like clowns and spooky like perceptual features. There's another one that's like infirmary, that's all doctors and bloods. And then there's one, I think lockdown is like a post-apocalyptic Mad Max world. They have like a lot of guns and stuff in there. And the reason this is important is that we can constrain our memory analyses within each segment. And now we don't have to rely on the features of the actual space to drive the emotion. Like I might be terrified of clowns, but like fine with blood. Anna might be terrified of blood, but fine with clowns because she's married to Mike. Oh, I just made that joke up on the spot. I just called you a clown in front of all your colleagues. And you like don't have a mic and there's nothing you can do about it. No, but what's nice about this is that you get this sort of idiosyncraticness across these events, and we can leverage that idiosyncraticness to sort of step away from the stimulus content itself, but have it be more about what the subject is feeling in a given moment to dictate how this is going. A couple important things. It's really good at evoking arousal. Heart rates were much higher in the haunted house than when we got baseline estimations in the lab. And these heart rate measures are important. So after they went through each segment, Chelsea, who actually cares about qualifying the world in a way and not just about memory, was like, oh, we better ask them how they're feeling after each segment. And we're able to find these changes in heart rate predicted how people experienced fear right after going through it. So we have this nice threat-related marker that it reflects physiological arousal that we can then map on to memory now. Okay. So we had free recall data. We were excited about it. Before sort of like just jumping into figures, I wanted to give like a qualitative flavor. So I pulled one of the higher threatened participants' narratives. Here it is. There was a lot of blood everywhere in that room. There was someone with like a saw at one point and a guy holding a saw that wasn't a chainsaw and walking around following people with it. I think there were nurses in the hospital room or a doctor, like gory nurses, and doctors like, this isn't winning a Pulitzer Prize, right? Like, I'm hoping what you draw from this is sort of two features. Memory fragmentation, whatever that means, is happening here. Also, there seems to be this really strong draw to perceptual features and sensory features. And this is something that those accuracy studies in the lab have let us know over and over again, right? As early in the 70s with Elizabeth Loftus, you show somebody a picture of a person holding a gun, they'll have really good memory for that gun, they're gonna have really terrible memory for the context in which the gun was placed or the face of the person holding it, right? What's nice about here is that we're starting now to see that this is happening for a real life naturalistic event that we can actually like control for accuracy. The same thing happened every night. So we can know it's not confabulation, we can know this is real things that are happening. Yep. They did not know they were going to have a memory test afterwards. Yeah, so they are just experiencing it naturally. We're right now analyzing some data that we're manipulating people's goal states during it to see what that does to some of these markers. But free recall is really miserable, like to score. So we're transcribing a lot of stuff for that. What did they think they were doing in the experiment? They thought they were there just to see how people experience fear, right? Like they knew they had the heart rate monitors on. They knew they were going to make questions about something afterwards, but they just didn't know what it was. Somebody's hand, yeah.
Could you clarify a little bit the difference between fragmentation of memory and maybe just the strength of free recall?
Yeah, no. I mean, yes and no. Can you hold on to that question, because what I'm going to be taking you through is my journey of trying to find an operational definition. Because right now in my head, fragmentation is a concept in search of an operational definition. So I'll let you know where we get, but I don't want to spoil the spoiler alert. Okay, cool. So first we wanted to basically just see if we can replicate what has been found in sort of the static literature, which is that you get this bias to perceptual detail. So we use the autobiographical interviewing assessment tool that lets you break things up into different types of memories. What we see is that individuals resolve on more perceptual details when they're in the haunted house versus when they're in the lab. Hopefully all of you are like, that's a really bad comparison, right? Like in the lab, they're sitting and just getting heart rate straps on and filling out questionnaires, and then they're like moving through a space while they're in the haunted house. If that struck you, so did every reviewer as we're trying to publish this. But the important part is we didn't just stop here, right? I'm going back now to the idea that this was broken up into segments, because this is where we can get the strength of it. So in our final analysis, what we did is that we used individuals' average heart rates for each one of those segments in the haunted house. And then we can look at their perceptual bias segment by segment. So we don't need to rely on the lab, but we can rely on the idiosyncratic differences that emerge from segment to segment in the haunted house. And when we do this, what we find is the greater threat-related arousal you have, the more biased you are towards perceptual details. And a part to start to whisper to your question about what memory fragmentation is, what are these other things? Like I'm saying bias towards this, that means it's getting biased away from something else. one of the big things is event details and action details. The things like, and then I opened a door, and then I moved through these space. We haven't formalized any analyses on this yet, but I think the stripping away of that is going to be an important factor for fragmentation.
So if somebody gets incredibly frightened by the very first segment, that sort of colors all the other segments, no
Right.
how frightened they are specifically by,
Right.
particular trigger.
So we luckily had a pretty good spread in this first one. In the second, when we went back, the first two segments were very low threat, and the last two segments were really high threat. So for this one, we're pretty in a safe space from order effects. And some of the data where they changed up the haunted house due to COVID, and it unfortunately now introduces this like order effect compound. Yeah. Which is why we should never just be doing naturalistic research and sort of need to do both. But we'll loop back to that too, thanks to Brandon. Okay. Yeah.
Can you just say a little bit about within versus between subject variability in the heart rate and perceptual bias, like how much of this is driven by people who are elevated in heart rate throughout and also show perceptual bias throughout?
Yes, so I can speak to it briefly, but then I can speak to it a lot later because we got intolerance of uncertainty questionnaires by this. So we're getting pretty good within subject estimations of it, but there is a group level thing too because people with high intolerance of uncertainty don't really show the effect. So somewhere in the middle, which we should really talk about. Yeah, because it's very relevant to our conversations earlier. Okay, cool. So greater perceptual bias. So then I was like, okay, this is it, right? Like you're walking through the space, all the perceptual biases are happening. That means you don't have any structure to put your memory over. And this is where memory fragmentation is. I will now define memory fragmentation as perceptual bias in the absence of context. And then I want to do a brief shout out, like all the work that's coming from this was like deeply inspired by my friend Sarah DeBrow, who recently passed away. But what Sarah got me really thinking about that I refused to think about before was retrieval and context, right? Like I just like would not think about these contexts or retrieval. And Sarah was obsessed with temporal context and how that gave us structure of the world. So I got sort of indoctrinated in the TCM. Have you guys heard of this before? No, I'm joking. Of course you have. So I got indoctrinated with TCM, and we started to use TCM to help us shape the way. Do you just appear when TCM appears on a slide? It's like you weren't here, and then I said the word TCM, and Mike just like pops up in a puff of smoke. Okay, so we got really, yeah. This is literally the first time your name has appeared on a slide, and you appear. Okay, so we got really excited about thinking about this through the lens of TCM, right? And in TCM, right, items get bound to a context, and then you use this binding of the restricting context to help you retrieve those items back in the order that they were presented. I wish you would have waited like 2 minutes longer so I didn't have to talk about TCM with you being here. But we thought this might be it, right? If you're so focused on perceptual details, you're sort of losing the temporal context, right? They're just living in isolation and they're not bound to the temporal context. So then when you go forward, trying to then reconstruct memories, they're sort of devoid of this thing that gives you continuity. And this is how you end up with a fragmented memory, right? So this was the hypothesis I moved into the world with. You know, like when you do research, or maybe you don't have this yet in your first couple of years, but then as you start doing research for a while, you have your like confidence alarm if this is going to work or not. And my confidence alarm was so high on this. I was so certain this is what was happening in the world. As you're going to find out, it's not that easy. My confidence was wrong. Okay, so what did we do? This is work that was done by Kate Cliver and Dave Gregory in my lab, and we now can go back to the haunted house data. And the other really important part of the haunted house data is that we know when things were happening. The same things would happen every single night. So we can map those events, score them in individuals' autobiographical memory, and then we can compute a forward-backwards score. We were very inspired by Nick Diamond with this, with the idea that if you're jumping forward in time, you might be showing more reliance on sort of temporal contiguity, moving you forward in space. But if you're hopping back and forth and you're not really using time, to structure the memory, right? So we would then predict that as your heart rate moves up, you have less temporal context, so then you might have more scattered hopping around memory, right? And what we found was a trend in the opposite direction. The more your heart rate went up, the more likely you were to make forward transitions in time. I was still so convinced that we were right that I was like, oh, this is just because we're using free recall. Like, who knows what people's retrieval demands were in the moment, right? Like, maybe they're trying to tell us a story, so that's why it worked this way. We're not into it. So then the next year we came back and I was like, you know how this is totally going to work? We'll switch to recency discriminations. This way we don't have all the murk of free recall. The murk that I love, but like, let's go back to our old school reliables. So what we did is we took the events, always got events that were next to each other, and we said, which one came first, right? So this way we can really see if they have a resolved temporal order or not. And I was like, this will certainly work. Again, wrong. So overall, everybody had better temporal order memory for the higher threat events than the lower threat events. Some cool stuff did emerge when we then started to think about, okay, but why? So what we did is we unpacked each segment into an early segment, a middle segment, and a late segment. And what we were finding is that there weren't that many differences in the early items and the late items, but where threat was really sort of improving temporal order memory was for these middle items, right? And it started us to think about, okay, maybe it's giving us a way to resolve from interference, because we often know items in the middle are the ones that sort of have to deal with both proactive and retroactive interference. So they're like, you know, the interference pile-on, and these perceptual details are letting them like pop up out of space, and it's like, okay, by interference, like I've got a really strong sensory detail, and then that way I can reconstruct things around this. Yeah.
What constitutes an item in this case? So is it like the blood bath?
Chainsaw Man or pig blood puddle. Things I would never imagine I would say during a talk. You know, your classic contrast of pig blood bucket and Chainsaw Man. Yeah, so they're not specific details. They're sort of a broader events, because the challenge with the haunted house is we don't know where they're looking, right? So it had to be like pretty big ensemble events.
Still within a scene as opposed to between scenes.
Yes, everything was done within one of the arms of the haunted house. Yeah. Okay, so focus. So like I finally was like, I'm wrong. Like we're wrong. It's not disrupting this. And then the gift of Brandon entered my world and is reviving me to not be fully resolved that we're wrong. Okay, so the haunted house is super uncontrolled, right? There's like a lot of stuff going on. Really cool data. I'm in love with it, but like there's not a lot of control in it. So, and this is a sort of a collaboration between Brandon and Elizabeth. Elizabeth was mostly working reward. Brandon came into the lab and was interested in threat. So we're like, okay, then he started working with Mike and we're like, well, now we need to have you doing threat and free recall, right? So what we did is we had these paradigms, two separate groups of participants. And what they did is in the threat group, they saw a cue that again indicated sort of having an aversive thing happen if they forgot the word the next day. In this case, it was a loud air blast because we had to run them online due to COVID. And then we had a reward group where they were just getting monetary rewards for some words and then no lower monetary rewards for other, right? So we are going back to this sort of distinction between threat and reward. And what we wanted to do then is sort of test the structure of memory and get at these things that we think had to do with memory fragmentation, namely things like the use of temporal context in memory, as well as some clustering around value. So rather than doing recognition, we did free recall. So they came back and they recalled as many of the words as they could with no instructions on how to order them. And then we were able to use that data to resolve some of these things about memory structure. One thing to note first, both groups showed memory better for the high incentive condition versus the low incentive condition. And I can't spend 30 minutes telling you the 18,000 different controls we had to do to resolve for those accuracy differences to start estimating our other types of structure measures, but we did a lot of them and they all keep on giving us the same answer every time when we control for them. If anyone wants to hear about the specific controls, I'm happy to discuss them, but it would be now till forever. Okay, cool. So the two things we wanted to look at was temporal clustering. That was sort of our main factor of interest, right? Because we think it's getting reduced. But then we also wanted to look at this thing of like category clustering. So like once I recall a high incentive word, do I hang out there for a while? I'm sort of giving you a sense of sort of semantic grouping of the words, or do I end up switching a lot, right? Switch between categories. So we calculated the both of these. So I'm going to show you the threat data first. And at first I was like, oh, man, I was really wrong. Like there was just no difference between temporal clustering between the high threat items and the low threat items. And I was like, I guess sometimes you're just wrong. Like you're just fundamentally wrong, even though all of your research is pointing in one direction, you're wrong, right? And I was like, okay, well, maybe it won't be in the temporal clustering, but I bet they're not semantic clustering either. And that was wrong too. They are semantic clustering. So these are switch transitions, which means that in the low threat conditions, switching more. Why did I backwards map this? I'm so sorry. It means that once people retrieve one high threat item, they'll continue to hang out in high threat items for a while, right? So we're still mirroring this thing. So I was like, oh man, it looks like they are still either showing no difference in structure when we look at temporal clustering, or they're showing more structure for the high threatening items. And then there was like a magical Zoom that I was having with Brandon and Elizabeth, and they were like, wait a minute, because we were just looking at Brandon's data. He did it second. And we were like, wait, those temporal clustering scores, they're pretty low. Like these are fundamentally low temporal clustering scores for a study. So then we brought back in the reward data and we're like, bingo bongo, right? Like we're now seeing like huge effects, right? But they're not happening at the item level, they're happening at the state level, right? Across the board. So it doesn't matter whether you're popping into one specifically threatening item or one non-threat item. This is sort of fundamentally disrupting the structure of memories across the entire experience, right? So it might be the reason we kept on sort of not seeing this factor is that we were in the haunted house, we were always zooming in on threatening items, right? And people look like they have structure around those threatening items, but they're maybe sitting on top in overall disorganized structure. So one way I've been thinking about this is say you encode these items during temporal context is getting bound to the items, maybe. In the haunted house, what we are seeing is that like, okay, maybe the neutral items aren't getting bound as strongly to their temporal context, but these high threat items are getting bound to it, and then we can resolve it, right? This is a space where I was like, okay, I was totally wrong. I got this wrong. Then we get to the word list study, and what we're seeing now is like, oh, wait a minute, there's like major disruptions in temporal context. So it's just not there very good, but when it is there, people can use it. It's just not there together. And where I think we're going with my guess at reality is that threat is disrupting your temporal context. It's making it less accessible overall. But I think, and there's two options of what could be happening with this other one. The threatening items are popping up out of memory, and you're finding a way to bind those. So this would be very akin to like Mara Mather's arousal bias competition framework, that you're holding all the threatening items in working memory, you're flushing everything else out, and then that way you're able to relationally bind them together. Another option, and I can't remember whose paper this was, and if Alexa and Emily can help me out, it'd be awesome, but somebody just did an event boundary paper that shows that people tend to jump from event boundary to event boundary to event boundary as anchors. And sorry to call the both of you out, but I just can't remember this paper. But people tend to jump on it. So it might be that these are the salient things, and like these are the most salient things that are giving us our architecture of experience over the course of a day, not necessarily of a segment, but over these long time periods. So you jump that way one to one. Or my third and favorite argument, which is one that Sarah used to make a lot of time, that people were so obsessed with temporal context when they were thinking about temporal order, but there is a way to solve temporal order without temporal context, which is just to use recency strength, right? Is this a really strong item memory or weak item memory? Use those to resolve the differences between which one happened more recently. And that has been shown by both Luke Jenkins and Sarah to rely on perirhinal cortex. If you want to guess which one I'm rooting for, it's the perirhinal cortex one, because then it would let everything sit together in one easy thing to tie up in a bow. Okay. So one last study and then we're done. and this I think speaks to your question, which is, are these fragmented or not? Like, I don't know if these are fragmented or not. I'm getting really confused, and I don't know what memory fragmentation was. And we got an NSF award for studying all this stuff, and they let you have these committees come and give you expert advice, and the expert advice was like me, Sean Pollan, David Rubin, just sitting and fighting with each other about what memory fragmentation was or wasn't. And I was like, this isn't fun. Like, it's not useful. But then in a moment of inspiration that I can't even remember where it came from, I can remember the memories of what it reminded me of is, I don't know if you've ever had like that friend who breaks up with their partner, and then they call you and they're like, and the dishes, and and you always said this, and it's just like, and this other thing is like, what are you talking about, right? Like, all these things are coming out, even in my own memory of that drive. Like, Mark thought an Uber driver. They thought I was an Uber driver. Like there was no sense of it. I was like, this is the thing that feels right about memory fragmentation. Does somebody understand it or not? Like, that is now the operational definition I want to use for memory fragmentation.
Memory fragmentation was just because of lack of clear expression.
I'm defining that now as what fragmentation is. Like, the inability to form a cogent memory.
Or cogently.
Cogent narrative or cogent memory?
Cogent memory. Can people, well, I'll tell you,
Because it's like the express.
right. Well, so let me tell you what we did, right? So we took the people's memories from the haunted house, we re-recorded them, so it's the same speaker for all of them to extract some of the individual differences that have to do with social context. Then we put those on MTurk, and then we had people rate how confusing do you find each memory, right? We had something in there that was, how do you find the narrative of this memory? And it didn't do as well. But they were highly correlated with each other. So we landed with, how confusing do you find this memory? And the first thing we looked at, we found that they were more confused by memories from the haunted house versus the lab. But again, we really do not like that lab measure. So then what Ian found was that if you look at the perceptual bias on a segment by segment basis, the more perceptual bias there was in memory, the worse people understood that memory. In this first study, we only subsampled like 10. We only subsampled the extremes of perceptual bias when we were looking at it. But then he's now flushed this out in 2 replication samples that were pre-registered, where we now are getting tons of memories that go across the whole spectrum of perceptual bias. And it's looking really consistent that the more perceptual bias there is in a memory, the less people are able to understand that. More so than the more action terms you have on it, more so in the ratio of episodic versus semantic details. For this data set, perceptual bias really seems to be dictating the confusing measures. Is this narrative? Like, probably narrative also, but then like, I guess it's like, what resolution do you want to approach it from? I'm not glued to this definition. It's just like a definition that like gave me some word, respite or something, I don't know. Okay, summary time. So what I'm trying to show you today is that like, in the face of threat, that evokes arousal sometimes, not always. When it does evoke a high sense of arousal, this might elicit these types of defensive behaviors like startle or freezing. That's going to drive information processing towards the amygdala and cortical medial temporal lobe. There's some cool animal studies that if you lesion the central medial amygdala, you get more hippocampal engagement, which is neat too. So it sort of fits in with that. That sort of drives you to perceptual biases because you're hanging out in perirhinal world, and then that sort of makes you land in a fragmented narrative. Then the reason I put these all up here is just to sort of highlight a peek into where we're going in the future. And a lot of this is about sort of resolving this, like pulling back and being able to resolve it. In work that is like 100% spearheaded by Chelsea with our shared student Joy. She's been looking a lot at curiosity and mindfulness as a way to break apart this relationship between threat and arousal. So curiosity as a technique for emotion regulation. With my graduate student, Nick Ruiz, we're now seeing what happens if we give people agency in the face of highly aversive events. So we either have people playing horror video games themselves or watching other people's gameplay just to look at like how important is it that I'm making the actions that move us through the space, because that might allow you to sort of engage the hippocampus more in chain events. We're also looking at manipulating retrieval goals in the moment to see if that can sort of reshape the way you formulate the memory. So what if I asked you about the haunted house? Tell me a story about your trip to the haunted house. Can you garner some of that information back by having that retrieval goal? And then finally, with my grad student, Shin, we're now sort of combining these ideas of retrieval goals as a way to sort of update the relationship between threat and arousal and seeing if you can modify memories that way. I know I should be saying the word reconsolidation, but like it is such a dangerous word that I am going to call it memory updating. Okay, after all of that now, all the thank yous in the world. A lot of people help with this work. We're still working on a lab photo with COVID. Maybe we got one somewhere, but I don't have it and didn't put it up. So by delay on COVID, meaning my COVID brain can't look through Slack to find a picture to put it up. And then the last thing, which I probably should have put on the first slide, but representation matters, blah, blah, blah. I'm a queer scientist. If you're a queer scientist and are looking for more representation or somebody to talk to, I am really happy to chat because I think it's important that we have sort of more of this in spaces and more communication around it. So really feel free to reach out to me on anything on that. And I'm very happy to take like so many questions, and I'm all done. Okay. Oh, how do I do this? Just
First time call.
back there.
Okay, great talk. So there's a lot of work showing that the locus coeruleus and like basic norepinephrine activity can be involved in like prioritizing information around event boundaries. I wonder if you think that that would interact with like threat and arousal situations, and how so?
Yeah, I think that I think this is all noradrenergic, like all of it. And my favorite data point to push this into the noradrenergic zone is there's this really cool rodent data. So I think the best way to tease apart like getting away from valence is to stick in an incentive state and see if you can induce the opposite behavior. So if you think about drugs, right, that's like a positive incentive state. If you use drugs a lot, people stop encoding it with their hippocampus as they move into habit systems. And it has been shown by everybody at Michigan, it's like the Michigan whirlwind of addiction behavioral neuroscientists, that norepinephrine is likely the thing that triggers that craving response, which shuts down the hippocampus. So I'm very on board with this being an LC norepinephrine story. And wonderfully, Dave Cluett at UCLA, he's doing all of that work, so I can just like wait for him to do it and then like cite it later because it's hard to image the LC. But he's doing really beautiful work in that space. But yeah, I'm totally on board with that. Yep.
Your office hours are showing?
Oh no.
No, that's not right. So I guess I have a question about your how you're trying to operationalize memory fragmentation that's based on the contrast between your example of your friend calling you who just broke up with someone and just spurting out random things about dishes and so on, and then what you actually did with the haunted house. And it seems like a difference between those and why you actually probably understood your friend, but why the haunted house listeners didn't understand the narrative is you have the context for the messy breakup and the troubled relationship, et cetera, but your M-Turkers hadn't been to this haunted house. And my guess is that if people who've been to the haunted house were getting those, they would seem much more coherent, right? Because they have the context.
Yes.
And so then my question is, with regard to your interest in trauma and how all this relates to memory fragmentation and trauma, like how you'd be able to use that operational definition. Do people have the context or not have the context, or does it depend on to who?
Right.
So, because I feel like that measure of confusion is both a function of what the speaker is saying and what the listener now who's rating the comprehensibility knows about the situation.
Yeah.
Right?
So here's this is sort of a weird, tacky way to answer this, but I think it's really cool. So I've been thinking about this a lot. My partner is starting a degree in social work right now, and part of what he wants to do, which I think answers your question, Sharon, which is why like none of these are my ideas. This is like stuff that Mark has been thinking about, is art therapy, you're right, a lot of it is used in the visual form, but there's this new emergence of thinking about creative writing as an art therapy, and like particularly through the lens of trauma. I think sort of giving yourself the gift of narrative fiction, but also making it like sort of interpersonally embedded narrative fiction might be a cool way to like invite trauma victims to build narratives around what can be disparate facts to help with like understanding or comprehending them. I've never like done counseling or anything, but this seems like a cool way to actually try to reintroduce, because you're 100% right. Like in the absence of temporal context, let's just jam more semantic context in to try to understand or make meaning of the world, right? Like we can fill in the gaps a little bit with the information. And I think Nicole Long, with you or Bryce, has that paper that if you like bias people towards semantics, it takes you from their temporal. Oh, is that with Bryce? Yeah. So there's this like trade-off between the two of them too. And I'm thinking what you could do sort of in a trauma narrative is like flip the trade-off. So if they don't have the temporal context or understanding or meaning making that's happening in the moment, you can fill that in somewhere with either schematized representations of this is like what had happened. Like sometimes I wonder when Mark asked me if it was an Uber driver, was he trying to help me frame a narrative that actually made me feel more safe in the space, right? I don't know if I answered your question.
Well, you didn't, but what you said was interesting.
Okay.
My question was really about your measure and does it suffer from the fact that it depends on what the listener knows? But let me now just turn that around and relate it to what you did say about this kind of therapeutic approach, which is if your participants as they were doing their free recall, they know they're talking to someone who knows about the haunted house. So they're choosing to prioritize information that they think is interesting and relevant. They don't need to provide the context, but if they were told somebody's going to have to understand your narrative who's never been to the haunted house, tell it that way. So I feel like you don't know right now what they know versus what they've chosen to tell you. What you do know is that a speaker who's not been to the haunted house can't make sense of it.
Right, 100%. And what's cool is we have this study outside of the domain of threat where we manipulate people's retrieval goals to share to a friend or tell it. And what I can tell you is we didn't put confusability ratings in that one because these were sort of two different arms, and I'm now full of regret with that. But what we do know is that when you say share to a friend, you pull out episodic and perceptual details and you amp up semantic details a lot. So there is something that when you know you're communicating to somebody else that you will like provide the infrastructure somewhere, but it would be cool then to sort of like weave that back into it. And I think we could do movie watching studies online too, and then just probe whether people were familiar with the movie or not, or something like that. But I think that's right. And I think what it could also be doing is that prior knowledge could get the listener's hippocampus on board to sort of like take over from the missing hippocampus from the storyteller. Yeah.
Deepu, so thinking about your talk, which was wonderful, I have a theoretical suggestion which I think aligns with your data, but I'm not sure, and that is that when you think about an arousing or a threatening experience, you ask, is it strengthening the contextual association or not? And if it is, how does that interfere with organization of the narrative? One way to think about that is that if you could have a situation where the temporal association, the contextual association to the threatening memory is extremely strong, but if that memory keeps popping up later because of either shared semantics or because the threat context is your working memory or whatever, that threat is evoking that memory over and over again, you could have a situation where simultaneously the context associations are very strong, but the order memory is completely messed up because it's now encoded a whole bunch of different times.
Yeah. Well, Mike, Emily Cowan, you guys should know each other now. I mean, Emily's been working on these models of replay in our lab. Emily's my postdoc about this idea of, what like we prioritize selection immediately, but then that selection gets prioritized and turned into replay, which then sort of provides things like generalization. And the one thing that sort of generalization like fundamentally can destroy, and we see this with data moving backwards and forwards with the generalizations in time, is temporal order. So I think that's definitely contributing to it, and definitely like turning up the knob on our results. One thing is, at least with the temporal order recency discrimination judgments, I didn't show, we have immediate data that shows the exact same size robust effect. So for that one, we're not super convinced it's something that's happening in terms of like a consolidation mechanism, but there's definitely instances, and the three of us should talk sometime too, because exactly what you're talking about with this, we're trying to model that right now with CMAR. Yeah.
Question from Michael Cohen through Zoom. So data from Dave Wolf and colleagues at Penn show reduced perirhinal cortical thickness at the earliest stages of age-related cognitive decline. How would you expect responses to arousing?
Oh, that's interesting, because it's not like you can surpass the perirhinal cortex, the hippocampus. I don't know. That's funny, because I would ask Michael that. I think he got the question. He got the question and answer part backwards. Backwards for it. Like, that should be the question I'm asking him. Yeah, I honestly, like, I have no idea, because like it's been hard. Like, a lot of what we garner from the lesion literature is often like a hippocampus with an intact perirhinal. There's two patients that I think Stefan Kohler has tested with a perirhinal knockout with spared hippocampus that show a lot of deja vu and like false familiarity. So I wonder if it would start to look at I said I don't know, now I'm just talking. Confabulation, maybe, like really semantically biased confabulation that you have a hard time distinguishing between like reality or not, and threat, I guess, would just like turn up the knob of that confabulate. No, or would it turn it down? I really don't know. Now I'm just sputtering words. Okay, cool.
I was just gonna also, well, I was thinking about this question, you kind of got into it with your answer to Sharon's question, was the feasibility of using data from an experimental context and the manipulation being treatment that involves cognitive restructuring of traumatic memories, which could be in a population of individuals with PTSD. It could also be individuals with anxiety disorders, where that's really the goal of treatment, and often that does involve writing out
Right.
a lot of things as part of the treatment, and then therapists might go through and like identify things that are causing issues, and then you can see the extent to which changes in that narrative over time through treatment, which is the manipulation, map onto real changes in symptoms.
Yeah.
Or even scanning people and seeing how that might change over time.
So have you seen this? It's sort of been done, but not really this way. Oh, he's awesome. He just started at Princeton. Eric Nook. Eric Nook has this gorgeous paper with Leah Somerville where they got all the Talkspace data, not all of it, but like thousands of Talkspace transcripts, because the whole thing is coming online and it's happening over time, so they can track symptom trajectories as you move through time. The measure he was looking at was temporal distancing from it, but if you like take a giant step back and look at the type of language they use to measure temporal distancing, it really looks like the more distant you are, the more semantic you are, and the closer you are, the more episodic you are. And then if you want to take this like to a third order chain, maybe the more semantic you are, the more storytelling you are. Right. So there's like something in there that I think feels really right. And we were just about like, he just started, but like, I've been like, let's be friends so you can give him that data set. Right. Because we could actually use that data set. Yeah. The only bummer about it is I think they're very CBT oriented in Talkspace, and I think CBT is not the right therapeutic intervention to resolve this space. But yes, I would love to do this, and if you how do we make it happen? And I would love it.
I have some other. I study people who have lack of threat sensitivity, so I'd like to talk to you about the other side.
Yeah.
Bring some of my participants to watch it happen.
And see if nothing works. Yeah.
See how unscared they are. Yeah.
I have another question from Zoom. If you open up the chat.
Oh my gosh.
There you go. I'm also happy to read it. In veterans with PTSD, do you think this memory fragmentation is robust enough to persistently learn therapy-based skills that are primarily learned through the lens of for example, get to attend CBT therapy for trauma they experienced 2 years ago, 5, 10, 15, is what they learned in therapy impacted by this fragmentation? Does it by chance lead to the issues we see in memory consolidation for therapy?
So I think I'm trying to figure out what is what they learned in therapy impacted by this fragmentation, and does it by chance lead to the issues we see in memory consolidation? Okay, so I think the question is, and the chatty should tell me if I'm getting it wrong, is sort of like, you have, like, does the fact that the memory fragmentation occurred change the way that the therapeutic intervention is working or not? And I think it would sort of have to, because you're sort of like, it's like what tools are on your toolbox to play with, right? And some of the restructuring is just sort of what's available in the moment to do it. And then I think sort of as a second order layer on top of that, and I've been thinking about this a lot with the memory communication data, is that like, oh no, the thing that therapists should understand the most is the thing that we're the worst at, right? Like it's this unfortunate trade-off that, like, again, if the therapist is trying to work with you in the restructuring space, like they have to build that narrative around it, and that becomes so much harder if the memory is fragmented to begin with, which is why, like, like therapists are like a red wine, like they age really well with time because they're like building those schemas up to understand it. So yeah, I think the memory fragmentation part would like slow it down quite a bit. But I'll talk to some of I mean, I need to talk to more PTSD clinicians because I don't get to see them a lot. So then I just read papers and make false assumptions. Cool. Thank you.